This podcast is a Christian view of the controversial subject of gender identity.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined via Zoom by Dr. Steve Willing. He is a physician and specializes in pediatric neuroradiology. And today we're going to talk about a controversial paper published in Nature Human Biology that claims anti-trans laws promote suicide in transgender youth. You don't want to miss this discussion. Well, Steve, welcome back to Star Cells and God. You've been on the show a number of times before talking about issues related to gender identity.
Yeah, thanks, Fuz. Here's the article that we're talking about on the first slide. It's entitled State-Level Anti-Transgender Laws Increase Past Year Suicide Attempts Among Transgender and Non-Binary Young People in the USA. That's quite a headline. I couldn't even read the whole thing in a single breath. This was published online in September of last year and then printed in the official journal the following month in the November issue of Nature. And what they claim in this report was looking at, population-wide and states that passed so-called anti-transgender laws versus those that did not, that there was an increase in suicide attempts among young people who are transgender in these states that passed anti-transgender laws, what they called anti-transgender laws. Well, what do they call anti-transgender laws? It would be laws necessitating that young people participate in athletics according to their sex and not their gender identity, or protecting young people from experimentation and gender affirmation. Anything basically pertaining to transgender was interpreted as an anti-transgender law.
Yeah, and this particular paper received quite a bit of popular media exposure, not just simply on science media outlets, but also major news networks. And, this paper probably is going to take on even greater importance because in the first few days of President Trump's second presidency, he signed 4 executive orders that could be interpreted as anti-trans, legislation of sorts. Right. So, for example, he had an executive order declaring that the federal government only recognizes 2 sexes, male and female. That was followed by another executive order banning federal funding for any gender-affirming care. He also took steps to limit the contribution of transgender people to the military. Many people think this will lead to a ban of transgender people in the military. And then finally, the most recent executive order denied federal funding to any organization that would allow transgender women to compete in girls' or women's sports. So in light of these executive orders, I can imagine that this particular paper is even going to receive greater exposure and probably be viewed with a greater level of importance.
Indeed, a lot of people are going to seize on this, along with pre-existing claims that this population is at high risk for suicide, and say that you're actually doing harm for the people. I would make one slight correction. What you said, President Trump didn't ban transgender care per se. What this specifically does is ban gender-affirming care for 18 and under. So adults are free to go on and do whatever they please in accordance with their physicians.
Yeah, well, thank you for that clarification. That's a really important clarification. Now, Steve, you wrote a excellent blog article for your blog, Soggy Spaniel. So if people want to check out your blog, I highly encourage it. You've got some great blog entries there that deal with a number of critical issues that we're confronting in our culture that have medical undercurrents. And you're highly critical in that blog article about the paper published in in Nature Human Behaviour. So we want to, unpack, some of your criticisms, but I want to make sure that people appreciate the fact that you are a really good person to do this, because not only did you spend the time really working in detail through this particular paper, but that you've also written a book called Superbia, which is a book about critical thinking and the important role that humility plays in our thinking process. And then also you were part of the gender identity team, still are, here at Reasons to Believe. And this is a team that consists of medical doctors, a biblical scholar, a philosopher, who addressed a number of critical issues relating to gender identity. And as part of that process, you and the team did a deep dive into the medical literature and reported on really what does the medical literature say? What does the evidence say regarding a number of critical questions relating to gender identity, including the risk of suicide among transgender youth. So you are a great person, I think, to engage this question in this particular paper, because you've done your homework, so to speak. Before we plow into the critique of this paper, maybe we could just take a quick second and help people understand why this whole conversation that we're having today is really important. Why are we taking the time to have this? There have been a few people, not many, but a few people that have criticized Reasons to Believe for taking on social issues, because we're a science faith organization and these are social issues. Why are we tackling these? And so, Steve, how would you answer that question? I don't know how I would answer the question, but how would you answer that question?
Well, I don't look upon this as taking on a social issue. I look upon it as biblical apologetics, which is what Reasons to Believe exists to do. When you talk about apologetics, a lot of different things come to mind, perhaps browbeating atheists with the arguments for the existence of God, or providing archaeological evidence for the authority and reliability of Scripture, or evidences for the resurrection of Christ, or the ongoing arguments about evolution and creation, to which RTB is no stranger. But rarely do people think about sexuality. In terms of defending biblical sexuality, very few actually have undertaken that. Recently, there's been a lot of work from the Colson Center with their Identity Project. It has a lot of now videos on this, but I think defending biblical sexuality from an apologetic standpoint is probably one of the highest imperatives. It certainly has a lot more impact on people's day-to-day lives than their opinion on the age of the earth or how life and the universe came to be. These things affect people on a daily basis in terms of leading to trauma, diseases, mental illness, social disruption, broken relationships, you name it. The list is just endless.
Yeah, that's a great response. And, I would add to that, while this is indeed a social issue, there's obviously political ramifications with regard to this issue. We're not really tackling it as a social issue or as a political issue. This is really also an issue that is undergirded in medical science. And so there is a very strong scientific component to questions about gender identity. And as you point out, it has implications for the biblical perspective on gender and on sexuality. I also think this project is important for for another reason. And that is a reason that you brought up, which is, there are real people that are impacted by this issue on a daily basis. There are people who are struggling with their identity in terms of their gender. There are parents who have children that are struggling with this. There are pastors who have members of their congregation who, as a family, are dealing with these issues. They need to have good quality information to even know how to start thinking about these issues and how to navigate these issues.
Oh, yes. And there's a lot of good quality information out there, but the challenge for the layperson is to separate the wheat from the chaff and to know where to look, because there are a lot of contradictory voices. what is sort of unique, almost unique to this subject compared to perhaps some of the other controversies, is is not something that breaks down upon secular versus religious lines. The pushback, the opposition, the criticism is coming from a lot of non-Christian sources, left of center, right of center, multiple religious traditions, atheists, agnostics. This is not some pet cause of white fundamentalist Christians, not even by a long shot.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point. And, as we approach this particular question through the Gender Identity Project, uh, we wanted to make sure that we were being fair with what the evidence said. So it was a balanced assessment of what the medical evidence said. We aren't looking at entering into the culture wars, but really trying to provide people with quality, trustworthy insights and information so that they can actually make sound decisions about their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. Okay, Steve, why don't we go ahead now and start to unpack this paper? And I think the first place to begin is really giving us a little bit more insight as to what was done in terms of the work presented in this paper. Maybe you could give us a kind of a summary overview of the paper, and then a little bit of a discussion of really what were the conclusions that these researchers presented.
As I mentioned at the opening, the claim was that they did this study and they claim to have shown that in the states that passed so-called anti-transgender laws, that there was an increase in past year suicide attempts among transgender youth. That was their conclusion. As I go through this, I would really first want to begin with the perspective of where this is coming from. Nature Human Behaviour, here I show on the slide, the editor, of the journal is Stavroula Kusta. She has made a bit of a splash with an opening editorial a couple of years ago justifying censorship of scientific data if it could be perceived as harmful to the population being studied. Here's the example of the title is called Science Must Respect the Dignity and Rights of All Humans. And this itself generated some pushback because she was openly arguing for the suppression of scientific data, which went against a particular narrative if it could be framed as harmful to the people being studied. Well, harm can cover a lot of territory. It can be stretched to its absolute limits, like if they lose politically, then that's harmful.
Yeah, that actually is for me as a scientist is quite concerning, because at the end of the day, science is about what does the data say, and we may not like what the data says. It may not fit our narrative, but science, if it's going to be an exercise that helps us move closer and closer to what is true about the world, you have to honor and respect the data, right? You can't screen the data or suppress data if it goes against your narrative. So that's deeply troubling, just even in general, let alone when you start talking about issues related to human behavior. What kind of harm can you cause by suppressing data, right?
Exactly. There's already a bit of a cloud of suspicion over this journal because of the express position of the chief editor. Now, this paper lists 6 co-authors. All 6 of them list as their primary affiliation something called the Trevor Project. This is an LGBTQ advocacy group, which was founded in 1998 and based in West Hollywood, California. Here I show you a picture from their homepage. It's called the Trevor Project. And one thing that the Trevor Project has been doing is conducting an annual survey. Well, how do they do this annual survey? Online recruiting through Facebook and social media, asking other LGBTQ people on social media to respond and fill out their survey from one year to the next. And the survey asks a lot of questions, including questions about suicidality. So that's the database that they use to study. Now, it's not a small database. They have something like, 45,000 answers per year, but they're not taking one person and surveying them every year for the next 5 years. Each year they start with a blank slate. So you have no continuous study of any particular individuals. They looked at the study period from 2018 to 2022 inclusive. So that's 5 years, five separate surveys, each a snapshot in time. And then what they did is they used something called a difference in differences technique method to say, okay, well, we'll take before these laws were passed as the baseline, and we'll look after these laws, and we'll compare the survey results in these. We'll compare the survey results in these people that answered from the anti-transgender states versus the ones that didn't pass legislation and see if the risk of suicide goes up. And that's what they claim to show.
Okay, so uh, when this paper was published, there was quite a bit of, as I mentioned earlier, response on the part of the news media. And so, maybe one question is why, right? I mean, it's not unusual for a scientific paper to maybe get a little bit of exposure, particularly in the popular science media. Occasionally, if something is interesting enough, it might even get some exposure in, outlets like CNN, NPR, Yahoo News, what have you. But this paper really made quite a bit of a splash. I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, yes, it was covered by NPR, by CNN, NBC, Time, MSN, and many others. And it's always dangerous to speculate on the motivations of people unless they express it. It fits a particular narrative of those who are considered LGBT or considered trans affirming, who think that transitioning is a great thing and that there is a large population of would-be transgender young people who would need to have the opportunity to transition so they can live according to their preferred sex rather than their birth sex. It's I mean, the media is a complicated thing, and you can't say I wouldn't argue that conservatives are any different. Fox News is going to run stories that are supportive of their narrative just as readily, and also it kind of has a shock value, which is another thing that drives media coverage, is what draws clicks, what pulls people's eyes, what generates emotional, visceral response, whether it's fear or anger. These sort of things, these sort of headlines are just par for the course with pretty much all mass media.
Yeah,
And this really is this prime candidate for such.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And as you said, it fits a particular narrative that uh, really sees people that are transgender as being victimized and persecuted, and that these anti-trans laws are doing a lot of harm. And of course, when we talk about things like increased suicide risk, we want to take those claims very seriously, right? We don't want to simply dismiss it. And even though the Trevor Project may have a particular ideological stance, even though they may be an activist group, if they are presenting scientific or claims based on some kind of scientific evidence, we want to fairly evaluate that. Just because you hold to an ideology doesn't mean you can't do sound and proper science, right?
Exactly. And that's why we have to be fair and honest. And that's why I went through this paper and really tried to understand what their data showed and what they were driving at. And I also have a friend who's had a long career in medical statistics and research statistics who also helped me with the analysis of his paper. And his response was immediately, they don't even provide enough data there to say whether it was done properly. They don't describe their methodology in any kind of useful detail. What they did, for an example, I look to see, okay, what are the actual numbers? How many more suicides are they talking about? Nowhere in the paper do they actually show there are more suicide attempts. nowhere. There's no numbers on the attempted suicides. What they actually are reporting is regression coefficients comparing the ones in the legislated states versus the control states, the states that didn't. And they're claiming to have positive regression coefficients. Well, that doesn't actually mean they go up. Here in this next slide, I have the red arrows showing that increased past year suicide attempts just in the sheer numbers of attempts. So it could be multiple attempts in one person. Still, it's a very low number. The red arrows show that you have a positive regression coefficient in the states that passed these laws versus the states that did not. The next slide shows at least one attempt. So anybody who's tried attempted suicide, and this shows very, very tiny positive regression coefficient. And it, you see on the scale on the left, that's 0.1 or less. Now, a positive regression coefficient, this can be very confusing because it implies that actually they did go up, but regression is not quite the same thing. Here in this next slide, I show, for instance, you have a treatment that is embraced by one population and resisted by another or less accepted. So in the line represented by blue, it goes down. Those are the resistant people in the green line. It actually goes down in both groups. But if the one in the control group goes faster, if it decreases faster, you have a positive regression coefficient. In this next slide, the purple line shows the difference between the two, and the regression is the slope of that purple line. So it's positive. So even if the rates go down in both groups, you can still have a positive regression coefficient. So I asked, did they actually have any hard numbers that show there was an increase? And there's nothing in the paper that indicates that.
Oh, I see. So that's a really critical point then, in terms of how they went about drawing the conclusions of the increased risk, because according to the claims from the paper, the increase in suicide risk can be as high as 72%, right? And so, just based on your characterization of the statistical analysis they performed, you begin to wonder what that number actually means. In your blog article, which again I would highly recommend people take a look at, on the Soggy Sparrow, so the Soggy Spaniel website, you mentioned basically a number of issues with this, and we've been talking a little bit about the statistical analysis that they used and the questionable statistics, but you also discuss a little bit about the data source as well. And so you mentioned already that that this is survey data that they collected from social media, or at least where they advertise the survey or the questionnaire through social media, right? But it wasn't a year-by-year study. It was essentially each year is a snapshot. So talk a little bit about the problems with the survey data that they're even using to do the statistical analysis.
Well, in normal scientific research, if you're going to use a survey, you want it to be very randomized, and you want to make sure that you're looking at a population that's representative of, that's relevant to whatever you're studying. If you're studying a particular disease, you want to make sure you have the appropriate balance of race and sex and age and risk factors. And if you have a control group, you want the control group to be representative and matched to you want the control group to be as well matched to the subjects as is possible. Well, when you're doing an online survey, there's no way to do any of that. There's no way even to verify the legitimacy of the inputs. I mean, any random Joe could go online and fill out the Trevor Project survey and throw their statistics off. Now, I'm not suggesting that they were engaging in fraud, but there's not really any safeguard to prevent other people from doing that. There are just so many problems. That's why this kind of online survey is considered it's not a totally worthless. I mean, these surveys, it's kind of like exit polls, in elections, how unreliable they are, but they're better than nothing. Well, this is sort of in that same category. These online surveys are not worthless. They often do provide useful information, but it can't be scientifically valid. It can't be really regarded as authoritative or scientifically balanced.
Yeah, you also point out too that there's no way to confirm that the answers to the survey questions were actually truthful. So if somebody had an agenda, they could fill out a number of surveys under different names, right? And uh, skew the results potentially one way or the other, right?
Well, there's so much subjectivity. I mean, what if you had a survey question, have you ever considered suicide? Well, that'd probably be 100%. Yeah, I thought about once for like 2 seconds and said no, but I would have to say yes, okay. And or somebody that's a lot different than somebody that's really been brooding over it for days and days and starting to think about methods and planning. There's such a broad range of possibilities that could say, yes, I considered suicide.
Now, something else that you point out that I think is really interesting and to me problematic in terms of the conclusions of the study, and that is that in their analysis they saw no difference in people contemplating suicide, whether before or after anti-trans laws were passed, but they actually saw increases in suicide attempts. That seems to me like the reverse of what you would expect. I would expect more people to be contemplating suicide and fewer people to actually act out versus people not thinking about it but attempting suicide. That, again, seems to be a result that calls into question the entirety of the study.
Yeah, they basically reported three answers to three questions. The first is the number of attempts overall. So if you had 10 people and 20 attempts, then you had a number of 20. The second was how many people or what percentage had a single attempt. So you could have maybe a population of 20 and only 10 had made any number of attempts, whether 1 or 20. In any case, it'd still only be 10 out of the 20 that hadn't made a single attempt. But the third one was, have you seriously considered suicide in the last year? And they report the data on this. And here I show in my next chart that at the third year after that, the subjects actually showed a statistically significant reduction compared to the control group, which is, it's a very small number, but some of their other positive findings are also very small, and they consider those significant. So I don't know why you wouldn't consider this significant as well. And it's sort of paradoxical and it is contradictory because at the one time their data is showing that the young people in what we call the subjects, who are the states that pass this law versus the controls, they're showing that the young people who are the subjects actually were less likely to seriously consider suicide 3 years after these laws were passed compared to those in the states that didn't pass the laws.
Yeah, yeah. And then you also bring up this point that the conclusions of the study display inconsistency with respect to real world data. So what did you mean by that?
Well, they're talking about, suicidality rates 40, 50%. We think, we don't really know, but they're in the body of the report, they talk about that. And in fact, we know from a number of series that the suicide rate is extremely low. It has, it's lower than the baseline, but there have been a couple of very recent studies. A 23-year population-wide study from Finland that was reported last year found that over 2,000 people across a 23-year period, there were 20 suicides, so less than 1%. It's about 0.5 per 1,000 person years. So less than 2 per year in the entire population of Finland among the trans community. Similarly, UK has looked at this because there was a similar backlash after they shut down the gender affirming care in UK. There were some claiming there was an explosion of suicides, and some people actually went through and very carefully looked at the data. And for the whole period from, say, 2018 up to the present, it's been consistently about 2 per year. It's a very small number, and there was no change, increase or decrease after the transgender care was shut down as a result of the Cass report. So overall, it seems the risk seems to be really blown out of proportion and exaggerated when the population is at some risk, but it's still a very small risk.
Now, my understanding is that for people that are struggling with gender dysphoria, particularly young people, that there is a greater suicide risk for that group compared to a control group, compared to young people that don't struggle with gender dysphoria. Is that indeed correct?
Yes, but it also is in line with young people who suffer from other mental illness. Now, some people may object to me calling other, implying that gender dysphoria is a mental illness. That's another discussion for another day. But historically, the main risk factor for suicide has been depression. I mean, that should just be intuitively obvious. So those who have major depression are at increased risk for suicide. Those who are transgender have a similar increased risk, not higher, not really lower. That was what the Finland study showed, that those who had their risk was right in line with others who had significant psychological morbidity that was put them at risk, anxiety disorders, depression, loneliness, past
Yeah,
traumas.
yeah. So that's really a very important point that, yes, indeed, transgender youth are at a greater risk for suicide, but it's not necessarily the gender dysphoria that's driving it. It's most likely the co-occurrence with other mental health issues.
Exactly. I mean, you have to wonder why this was never identified as a major risk factor before 10 years ago. There has been globally an increase in suicide risk among young people, which has been across the board, but that's been more strongly linked to social media and decline of unstructured play and the collapse of moderating institutions like family and church. That's something Jonathan Haidt's written about extensively with the anxious generation that's getting a lot of press now. So there has been an increase in suicide, but at the same time, it's helpful and maybe somewhat reassuring for people to know that you're talking about a rise from a very low baseline. It's always tragic. It's always heartbreaking to see a young person take their own life. It's certainly more heartbreaking than an older person, but it still is the middle age and older adults that are much, much, much higher risk of suicide than young people.
Okay, so at the end of the day, uh, the conclusion really is that the claims of this study, even though it was published in what we would consider to be a reputable journal, Nature Human Behaviour, is really uh, a study in which the conclusions don't seem to be well supported by the evidence presented in the paper. And so we could say that the conclusion is that these are questionable claims at best, and that this paper really doesn't demonstrate what the claim is.
Well,
So,
there's been some evidence here that they're going out of the way to get the preferred conclusion, because I mentioned in the article, they use this difference in differences technique. And
hmm,
there's a few ways you could approach that. One is to just divide them into four groups: control and subjects, before and after legislation. So, four quadrants. You could just look at those. And when they did that, when they just compared the whole population before and after compared to the controls before and after, there was no statistically significant difference. They did not find a difference just
hmm.
doing that. They had to further break it down by year and look at each year after the legislation was passed. And it was only then, through that means, that they were able to get positive regression coefficients.
Okay, so bottom line is, the um, the claims are again questionable. Um, so you mentioned in your blog article that this is really troubling to you, right? And so maybe you could unpack why you find these questionable claims so troubling.
Well, various suicide prevention groups and suicide activist groups, they've established guidelines for how to talk about this responsibly. And what they strongly um, suggest against is language that suggests that it is normal or to be expected or that it's common, or used like we're using words like epidemic because children are so imitative. The UK Independent Report came out looking, that's the one I referenced earlier, that they found no increase in suicide in the UK after the gender hormonal blockers, the puberty blockers were banned. I have this on a slide. I'll just take a minute just to read it because they did such a great job. What they said is, I'm quoting, "The way that this issue has been discussed on social media has been insensitive, distressing, and dangerous, and goes against guidance on safe reporting of suicide. One risk is that young people and their families will be terrified by predictions of suicide as inevitable without puberty blockers. Some of the responses on social media show this. Another is identification. Already distressed adolescents hearing the message that people like you facing similar problems are killing themselves leads to imitative suicide or self-harm, to which young people are particularly susceptible." So this kind of language has been identified as dangerous by people who are not, conservatives or have a religious agenda. This is the scientific community. This is the UK National Health Service.
Yeah. Okay. So that's again a sobering point that I think we all need to pay attention to. And it seems to me, just based on my conversations with you, with Dr. Christina Cerrucci, who is also part of the Gender Identity Project, that this idea of so-called scientific papers being used to support different aspects of gender affirming care or to promote gender affirming care, uh, that the fact that these are that there's a questionable study here seems to be a pattern. This isn't something that is in isolation. Is that fair to say?
Yes, there's been a disturbing trend in there. There have been a series of papers coming out that are showing exaggerated findings or suppressing findings or stating conclusions that are directly opposite to what their own data actually shows. There's been many examples of such papers appearing in the New England Journal of Medicine, appearing in JAMA, coming from institutions like UCLA or University of Washington. For somebody who wants to see many, many examples of this, I refer you to the Jesse Singal, Singal Substack. He's a secular left of center journalist who's been all over this, who's been following this for some years now. And he's done a really masterful job of going through and dissecting these papers. And he coined the term Potemkin science after the Potemkin village, this fake village that was created to intimidate invading armies. Potemkin science, it's surface dressing, it's window dressing, there's no substance to it.
Yeah, and when this is exposed, there are broader implications than just simply, what does this mean to the whole discussion around surrounding gender affirming care. It actually has the potential con- to contribute to the distrust that the public has of science and scientific institutions, right?
Oh, yes, that really makes it so much more difficult for us, for mainstream physicians, if we want to recommend a particular treatment, or if we're recommending, infection control measures or vaccinations, and someone can come back and say, well, look how bad the science is. And it's very hard for us to sometimes defend against that because they can really point to a lot of examples where the scientific evidence has gone off the rails, or the publication, the community has gone off the rails with bad research, bad science. And it kind of contributes to polarization because the barrier to entry for creating a scientific journal is next to zero. Almost anybody can go out there and create a journal, and then you can appoint your own editorial board of your own, of like-minded people, and then you can start publishing away. And you can say everything on here is peer reviewed. Well, it's reviewed by handpicked people who already agree with what's being published. And that makes it so much harder to ferret out the reliable science from the unreliable science.
Yeah, and then when you have maybe the world's most prestigious science journal, Nature, publishing work that's appears to be suspect, that's only exacerbates the problem. So it's not like some kind of fly-by-night journal that has very low reputation. This is Nature, right? And the Nature family of journals. That's the you know the gold standard for scientific journals.
Yeah, well, it does, but they have spawned off a lot of children. There are now a lot of journals in that family. It does seem kind of a general principle that the more fragmentation you get, the more multiplication of sources, the standards kind of have to go down. And it used to be very hard to get published in Nature. You'd have to be top quality research. But now if they have 30 journals, then clearly there aren't 30 times as many people creating top-notch research. It just means that they're going to have to start lowering the bar.
Okay, well, a couple other questions, and this may be a controversial question, but this is a controversial topic. But as we mentioned at the top of the show, President Trump issued an executive order uh, banning federal funding for gender-affirming care, and as you pointed out, for children under 18 years of age. Do you think this was a justified executive order? And this isn't, I'm not asking this in a political sense, but more from the perspective of medical science relating to gender-affirming care.
Well, yeah, of course, there are two sides to that. There's the scientific side and the medical side. The scientific side is, yes, I think it's justified. We're actually um, really following the lead of other places like the United Kingdom or Finland or Sweden, which had acted much earlier to put an end to these puberty blockers and gender affirming care in minors. The political side to that is whether it's good policy. And of course, my concern was, okay, well, it feels great when I agree with a policy, but what if they came down on the other side? I mean, if this can be solved by executive order, then somebody else could have just ordered that every state must provide gender affirming care. So how comfortable really are we putting this in the hands of an executive? Kind of the other thing that comes up is I need a blank. Give me a second here. Edit this out. But um, the other thing that comes up is I have friends who are, okay, more left of center, or maybe didn't vote for the guy. And oftentimes what I hear is, well, we should keep the government out of healthcare. We should keep the government out of medicine. And unfortunately, that ship left the harbor 60, 70 years ago. If you get the government out of medicine, then you're talking about, okay, we got to get rid of Medicare, got to get rid of Medicaid, we got to shut down the CDC, we got to shut down the FDA. Um, we have to end HIPAA, we have to do all these things. The government is all over healthcare. There's just no getting past that. So we just have to navigate what we're in. We have to deal with it.
Now, I mean, the gender identity team again wrote this really useful research document, and it seems to me that at the end of the day, gender affirming care really probably does more harm than good. The puberty blockers, the cross-sex hormones, as I understand it, can cause irreparable damage to young people. The gender transitioning surgery seems more like mutilation than anything else, quite frankly. But yet there are people that are struggling with gender dysphoria. So is gender affirming care good? And if not, what is the best way to really address young people that are struggling with their identity in terms of gender?
Well, the gender affirming care in minors is really a relatively new thing. It began with the Dutch protocol in the early 21st century, and then it sort of exploded in the 20 teens. And the standard of care prior to that was what they called watchful waiting. Basically, this small number of kids with gender dysphoria, you would just kind of provide them emotional and psychological support, deal with other conditions that may exist like autism or anxiety disorders or depression or trauma, provide support, and on the average, 85% of would desist. So it's called watchful waiting. And that was a standard of care. It really probably should still be the standard of care. Now, there's this push towards transitioning. There simply has been no evidence that it helps, but we do know that the puberty blockers and the cross-sex hormones do cause net harm, do cause known harm to young people.
Yeah. So really if you're a parent or even a young person watching this that is struggling with issues of gender dysphoria, if you're a pastor or somebody that helps to guide and advise families that very well may be struggling with this, the real encouragement here, and that we're not offering medical advice to be clear, but the real encouragement is to 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 maybe put the brakes on any kind of gender affirming care and really look for, as you said, getting psychological help and psychological support first and foremost, and really wait before you start thinking about gender affirming care.
Exactly. I mean, the standard of care has been watchful waiting, and these children often do need psychological support. Even the good studies that, show benefit from gender affirming care, they always included psychological counseling. So then you can't tell whether they improved because of the gender affirmation or they improved because of the counseling they received. All these children can benefit from counseling. But there's no evidence that the transitioning itself happened really helps. And to parents or grandparents, anybody who has influence over these kids, I would strongly recommend putting a brakes on this. Do not head down that pathway. There's no evidence that it is a benefit, and it's known to be harmful. If necessary, get them off social media. That's clearly been identified as a factor in driving the explosion in transgender identification. If you're in a state where they can transition the kid without your parents' permission, I would suggest relocating someplace where you can protect your own kids from state intervention. Um, but I think providing the supportive care and eliminating the negative influences should be paramount, and wrapping it in prayer, careful prayer.
Well, as we bring this particular episode to a close, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk maybe more in theological terms now. Uh, what should our response be to, as Christians, to people in the trans community? It seems to me like we want to be very careful not to demonize people in the trans community. And so what should our response be, Steve?
Look upon them as ordinary people just like everybody else. We're all sinners. We all stumble in different ways. We all have issues. We all struggle. Um, every person, is of immense value in the eyes of God. We are all made for eternity. Uh, the C.S. Lewis quote, "There are no ordinary people. We are all, just made a little lower within the angels, and they are of infinite worth, just like all of us." I do think it's harmful to wrap one's identity around one's sexuality. The Bible actually talks a lot about identity, and it says, our identity can be wrapped in that image of God that's within us. So we can base our identity on being divine creations in the image of God. We can base our identity in Christ. Bible actually talks about kind of suppressing some of those identities that divide: barbarian, Scythian, Greek, slave, free, male, female. The Bible actually talks about kind of namely tamping down those identities that divide us. But particularly wrapping your identity around sexuality seems like particularly harmful to those people who've gone down that pathway. We are so much more than our sexual preferences and our genitals and the male female thing. We are so much more than that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then the final question, how do our struggles, or at least do people's struggles with gender dysphoria relate to the gospel?
Again, I think they're kind of basing their identity in something that cannot provide personal fulfillment or satisfaction or peace. Um, you know, it's just like C.S. Lewis again talked about, choosing to play in the mud when you could be enjoying a holiday by the sea. Uh, it's not that they're choosing badly, it's that there's so much more they could be aiming for. Life could be so much better.
Well, you and Dr. Christina Cerrucci were two of the panelists at this past November, at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting. The Natural Sciences and Christianity Study Group had a session that they sponsored on gender identity. And both of you did a marvelous job with your presentations and your contributions to the panel discussion. But one of the panelists was Katie McCoy, who's written on this issue before. And one of the things that I heard Katie McCoy say in another venue was that, when people are expressing struggles with their gender identity, what they are saying is that there's something wrong with them, or they perceive something wrong with themselves, and that they are looking to do something radical to change themselves in order to try to solve what they think is wrong with them. And her point is that isn't that exactly what the gospel is all about? Is that we all recognize that there's something wrong with us, right? And what's wrong with us is the fact that we struggle with sin. And there is a radical transformation that is needed, but that transformation is in a spiritual dimension. It's not in our physical makeup, but it really is recognizing our sin and laying that sin at the foot of the cross and embracing the forgiveness that Jesus offers us, and through that process undergo a transformation that sometimes is referred to being born again. So I thought that was just a beautiful point that showed how the gospel is really relevant in these conversations, that the transformation that people struggling with gender identity need isn't surgical. It is only found in the transformation that comes when we embrace the work of Christ on the cross.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I don't know if you remember where you heard that. I think I've heard her say that before. Was there a Strong Women podcast with Sarah Stone Street, perhaps?
Yeah, well, that could be a place where I heard her at a small gathering of scientists and theologians make that point. But yeah, so she's probably made that point elsewhere as well. Yeah. Well, Steve, I mean, this has been a difficult conversation in many respects. I appreciate how much work you put into really looking at this paper that was published in Nature Human Behaviour in detail, and really the fair and balanced way that you analyze that paper, and helping us really understand what that paper is and isn't telling us in light of the broader discussion happening in our culture regarding gender identity. So thank you for the time, and thank you for being with us on Star Cells and God.
All right. Thank you, Fuz, and God bless.
And I want to say thank you for joining us on this episode of Star Cells and God. Please join in the discussion in the comments. We want to know what you think about today's topic. And remember to like this video and to share it with your friends, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can get access to other future episodes of Star Cells and God, which release every Wednesday. Also, remember, as we bring this whole program to a close, that the more we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe in the triune God of the Bible.